Hi, my name is Daniel, and this is my review on The Inheritance Games, a short fiction slash mystery novel by Jennifer Barnes. The title is pretty self-explanatory. It's literally about an inheritance and people working together to solve the mystery that goes with it, kind of a game. And yeah, so this will just be my spoilers review. So let's start with a brief summary of The Inheritance Games. The Inheritance Games takes place in present-day Texas, the United States. The story focuses on our protagonist named Avery Kylie Grams, whose mom died when she was 15 and whose dad barely appeared in her life. Her legal guardian is her sister Libby, who takes care of her, but even so, she's barely making it by. Her greatest dream is to travel the world one day, but so far those dreams are unrealized. Then one day at school, she's called to the office. From a man named Grayson Hawthorne, she learns that Tobias Hawthorne, who was an extremely wealthy, influential, but also kind of mysterious and eccentric billionaire, died. And that she, for some reason, despite not even meeting this guy or even knowing of his existence, she is one of the recipients of Tobias Hawthorne's will. She's puzzled. She boards a private jet with her sister Libby to Hawthorne House. She meets several people, including Tobias's law firm, Tobias's daughter, and his 4 grandsons, Nash, Alexander, Grayson, and Jameson Hawthorne. When they gather together, the will is read by his lawyers, and then they realize something is weird. Tobias's last will gives tatters, pieces of his grand fortune to his security, his daughter, and his grandsons. Yet most of the money, nearly all of it, $42 billion, is left to Avery Kylie Grams. What's more, Avery now gets his security force, his law firm, his foundation, and his entire house. Now, Tobias left all of his money to someone who didn't matter to him and literally had no relations to him. So we have no idea why this happened, which is the central mystery of the book. Avery must figure out the secret passages and the tricks in this mansion to figure out the last riddle Hawthorne made. Here are all the main characters. So we start with Avery Kylie Grams, our protagonist. She is a smart but hard worker who's strategically planning out her life to get good enough grades to get into a university and to work because she's been raised in pretty terrible conditions so far. Then she becomes a multi-billionaire, and now she has to put her brilliance to a new use, figuring out Tobias Hawthorne's last riddle. Next, we have Libby, who is Avery's goth but kind of optimistic sister, who will do anything for Avery and Libby's loved ones. Tobias Hawthorne is a multi-billionaire philanthropist who's carrying out his final plans even after his death. Grayson Hawthorne is a cold but responsible Hawthorne brother, willing to bribe, threaten, and buy out. Jameson Hawthorne is another Hawthorne brother who's a wild sensation seeker, who only wants to experience more life in the life that he has left. Nash Hawthorne, a traveling cowboy who should have been born in the 1600s considering how he acts and what he does. Xander Hawthorne, a childish Hawthorne, but he knows more than he lets on. Sky Hawthorne, an eccentric but loving mother of all 4 of her boys. Oren is Avery's new head of security because Tobias left him to her after his death. Elisa, Avery's liaison for her firm, which is also because of Tobias's death. And Thea, a girl Avery meets at her new school, who knows a lot about the death of a certain person named Emily. Now let's get on to my personal review of the Inheritance Games. First, we have emotional variation and characterization. So the Inheritance Games has a lot of emotional variation in many parts because we only see one person's view, which is Avery, our protagonist. She goes through a lot of high points in her journey, especially discovering all her secrets. Also felt the dread of inheriting a house that belonged to someone with a lot of free time and an unhealthy addiction to puzzles. She experiences a lot of hopeful moments, but also has dark moments in her life too, especially things like, assassinations. The contrast in her experiences is jarring, but it's placed super well. One of my favorite examples in the book is when she first got her inherited fortune. She was extremely paranoid because she realizes that everyone else would want to murder her to get the money back. And she knew that each of the Hawthornes, including the 4 brothers and their mother Sky, were indescribably disappointed and angry that they didn't get to inherit the billions that they thought when Tobias Hawthorne died. So she was really paranoid. She thought she was about to be assassinated at any moment, but her security officer, Oren, assured her that she couldn't be assassinated. So she wasn't supposed to be that nervous. And over time, she does feel a lot more safer in her house. And once she got, more friendly with the other inhabitants of the mansion, she began to get very soft and comfortable. So when she's shot twice by an attacker, she was so angry with herself from getting too cocky and too overconfident in her own safety. And this marks a lot of change in her character, a lot of the paranoia and not getting used to her environment to finally being more open, to being more soft, and then becoming terrified and paranoid again after she was almost assassinated. The other characters were a lot less easily shown because this is a first person point of view book, so we only really get to see Avery's own thoughts. But most other characters generally had, round personalities and had their own developments. Her sister Libby, for example, starts off as a people pleaser, and she never says no to anyone or anything anyone asks her to do. After her ex-boyfriend Drake nearly kills Avery, she realizes how wrong she was to not fully break off contact with him. It makes Libby realize that not everyone needs to constantly be helped and that she shouldn't accept every single thing that anyone else wants her to do. The Hawthorne brothers, all four of them, had decent personality in my opinion, especially since two of them weren't even particularly involved in Avery's journey. And they felt really like individual people, not just faceless clones of each other, which I really appreciate. Okay, so my favorite character has to be Tobias Hawthorne, even though we don't really know too much about him since we never get to see him in person. But despite that, I know he was someone who could take risks and manipulate events to his favor even after his death. So far, it seems like the purpose of his final riddle was to give Tobias Hawthorne II his rightful inheritance, but really, who knows what will happen next? He risked the life of Avery Kylie Grams, a very risky gamble, and his grandchildren's inheritance just to make sure his plan went through. And honestly, I can respect him for that. So for the next part, which is ideas, topics, and themes, the Inheritance Games features a few mature themes like casual attempted assassinations and abusive partners, but was pretty overallly lighthearted for a book about someone who suddenly gained around $42 billion for no apparent reason. The novel focuses mainly on the theme of riddles and clues. And, there's a lot of examples, like the overarching conflict in the book, which is that literally a huge puzzle made by Tobias Hawthorne to get Avery to inherit his mansion. Quote, at the end of the day, even if you thought you'd manipulated our grandfather into this, I can guarantee he'd be the one manipulating you. So yeah, that's definitely a huge thing about the whole mysteries, about the whole clues, every letter, every word. And that's basically what the entire thing is summarized on. Smaller mysteries are equally important, like the existence of a girl named Emily who mysteriously died after spending time with the Hawthorne brothers, or the mystery of who let an assassin in to try and murder Avery. And although the riddles in this book were interesting, another theme that I thought was much more entertaining was the difficulties of being rich and famous. After Avery suddenly just inherits a fortune casually, the public is obviously amazed. People don't just randomly gain $42 billion all the time. The news obviously are now really obsessed with her, and they all want to interview Avery either for profit or for publicity. Every time she leaves the house, there's a huge mob of reporters wanting to know A, how she got the money, and B, why she got the money. This is a huge drastic change from her pace of life before and how she deals with certain events differently. She has to dress up in higher standards, and her lives into the Hawthorne firm, which is Elisa, has to micromanage everything Avery does all the time just to make sure her image doesn't get ruined. And one moment I really liked in the book was when, after her near death, Avery has to practice phrases to say to the public so that she doesn't get herself completely ruined. Quote, if it hadn't been for the 7 rounds of practice questions I'd been put through earlier, the last one would have gotten me. So for written quality in the Inheritance Games was not terrible per se, but I was disappointed. Okay, I'll start with the good parts. So there was a lot of foreshadowing hidden all around the book that could be hints for what would happen later, like Thea and Rebecca, or Emily's mysteriously everybody blaming themselves for her death. And the tension in this book was great too. It was magnificent. Like, it was 99% of why I kept reading the book was because I wanted to know what would happen next. Every mystery was bound pretty flawlessly into the plot, and each one was important in its own way. The book was so hard to put down because of, like I said, the tension. I want to know what's going to happen next. The grammar, punctuation, sentence structure were all great. So what really went wrong? Onto the flaws. Okay, let's get on to the flaws. So the first flaw, in my opinion, is the chapter transitions. I'm sorry to say that so many of them were pathetic. The chapters had really awkward endings and they were so cliche. Basically, someone says something super dramatic to Avery, and then they just turn 180 degrees and walk in the other direction stupidly. What? How does that make any sense? This isn't even just guesswork. That the ending of chapter 17 to chapter 18, for example, is just Xander, after talking dramatically and expositioning, walks away. That's not what humans do. And another problem is that a lot of the time the plot seems to be unbelievably convenient to Avery. Everyone seems to just walk forward, spout out a bunch of exposition, and then they just walk away. Oh, like some of the conflicts too. For example, how do we get the mystery of an assassin to thicken the book? Because somehow Oren, the head of security, who is quite literally stalking Avery to protect her during the entire book, somehow at this very moment can't notice that someone is shooting at Avery. And this plot convenience is literally just to make Drake a more important antagonist than before. There's no other reason this happened. Then Elisa uses Avery as a bait to catch the assassin, which is one of the worst plans I've ever seen succeed due to plot convenience in a book. This shouldn't have happened at all. Another thing is, how does Avery solve every mystery? Through the power of the Hawthorne brothers' amazing plot powers that can solve every mystery and conveniently do anything they want. Again, another example of just plot armor is both bullets miss Avery when someone tries to assassinate her. She was standing still. They shot twice. It just doesn't make any sense. Every single plot convenience is just stuffed in to progress the story, and it's just too much. The third flaw is the romance. Now, I've never been too interested in romance in novels, but I will say very honestly that this book did it horribly. Its cover says that features illicit romance, which I was not actually even close to appreciating. But then when I actually read the book, it was a lot worse than I thought. It was so awkward. Avery's in love with Jameson while also being infatuated with Grayson. Emily was also in love with both Hawthorns. It just makes no sense. And worst of all, Avery's romance played literally no important role in the story, other than existing. So what gives? Why add this awkward and ultimately useless romance in? Because it just doesn't do anything and it makes the book worse. Now, the final and fourth flaw is the climax, which was extremely disappointing. As I mentioned before, this book has an amazing tension that kept me reading the entire time. But the end was really slow. It was a huge overload of just exposition upon exposition. It literally carried on for chapters 84, 85, 86, 87, and 88. 5 chapters in total was spent trying to just add more exposition as a climax. There was really no real climax, just a bunch of information. It was a huge letdown to the tension from before, and I expected something so much more. Yeah, that was my review, and I'll give the Inheritance Games its final score from me. And in my opinion, it's a 16 out of 20. I really like the mystery and the riddle theme and the difficulties of maintaining an image when Avery suddenly becomes super rich and famous. My favorite moment was definitely when we realized that, major spoilers, was actually Tobias Hawthorne, the son of our normal Tobias Hawthorne, and that he would be the main focus of a sequel. And that was a really great cliffhanger to end off on, but unfortunately, each flaw, mainly the chapter endings, the plot convenience, the really badly done romance, and the disappointment of a climax, made me dog off some points and dented my image of the book. So I won't really give it a really high score, but generally it was a great book. So yeah, that was my whole review of The Inheritance Games, a fictional mystery novel by Jennifer Barnes. And I'll share my favorite quote to end. Quote, I thought of the letter that Tobias Hawthorne had left me. 2 words, no explanation. Your grandfather was a piece of work, I told Xander. Unquote. So it just perfectly represents the theme of the story. Tobias Hawthorne being confusing and Avery having to solve his last riddle.